Welcome to the Reinventing Education podcast. This is a podcast for folks like yourself who might be interested in reinventing what education is. I'm Rob McLeod and joined, as always, by the white t-shirted Brendan O'Leary. How are you, Brendan?
I'm fine, Rob. How are you?
Your shirt says beautiful nature on it?
It does indeed.
And is that a husky pup in the front or a mink? I can't tell.
It's a mink, some kind of mink.
We have a guest today. Care to do intros?
Yeah. So we're very happy to be joined today by Malcolm Giles. So he works in the American and English Studies department at a university in Germany. He teaches students that are training to become teachers. And so a big part of our discussion today is about teacher training. And Malcolm says he uses the parts of his course to explore teachers' expectations and thoughts on teaching, and tries to get his students to think about the differences in the different learning environments using a range of media. He is an integral master coach and has trained and graduated with the Integral Coaching Canada back in 2013. And prior to that, he worked in youth theatre in Leeds and London in the UK before moving to Germany. He set up the Young London Open Space Theatre Group in the 1990s, which brought together young people from different backgrounds and parts of London to devise and perform adaptations and original pieces relevant to their lives and interests. Now, inside his class, he uses some of the tools from his background in theatre, such as group games and improv techniques, and the theoretical background for the professional and personal development of his students. And he sees that as a powerful learning approach in education. He particularly focused on something he called a Fluency Booster, in which he uses the AQUAL, that Rob maybe can give a little bit of a heads up on in a moment, to tie into the development of language skills. So it was a really interesting chat. Spoiler alert, we already did the chat, and this is a recorded intro. It's really cool. It's really good, and we hope you enjoy it.
We really appreciated Malcolm reaching out to us. He had been listening to a few of our episodes and wanted to have a chat. And after speaking with him, we thought he'd be a perfect guest on the show. He's taking components of integral theory. Brendan mentioned AQUAL, being all quadrants, all levels, lines, states, stages, and types. Taking some of the components, which we also do here on the podcast, and embed them in his pedagogy and what he's doing with regard to training the next generation of teachers, which is something we've not focused on yet here on the podcast, about what does teacher training look like and how might it be influenced by the different approaches to school. So enjoy our chat with Malcolm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of two professions, I guess. I'm trying to manage. One is working currently in a German university in the English and American Studies department, and there I work only with trainee teachers. So they're going to become classroom teachers with English as one of their subjects. So, I mean, my role, as I said, is really just to help them develop the sort of skills and knowledge around what it means to teach English in a classroom in different levels, different ages, and stuff like that. But what I started to pick up quite early on. I mean, I'm also trained as an integral coach, so I started that training about 10 years ago, and it's from a fascination with Wilbur and spiral dynamics. Which began actually once I moved to Germany. I just suddenly, I think almost as I got off the plane, I just started picking up these messages and these invitations to come to this workshop. Can you do this for us? Would you like that? And suddenly, this whole Wilbury world emerged. And around about 2010, I discovered this integral coaching approach. So I thought, well, this is what I need, some structure, some means of taking this into the world in a meaningful way, And Integral Coaching Canada were the ones that had done that work to adapt Wilbur's work for the world of coaching. And that's a really fantastic method, and one which I have applied in one-to-one coaching over the years, but became more interested in how to use it in more group situations. And obviously, when I started working at the university, the first thing I kind of thought of, well, this is really useful for them to have these perspectives and see things through these frameworks. So just finding ways that I could apply that into the work that I do at university, because coming back to what I was sort of saying a little while ago was it became clear to me from conversing with these students that it didn't seem to be much depth to their training as teachers. It's just some kind of format where they're left to learn about one type of approach, another type of approach, and talk about the differences, but I don't know, not really get it, no interior, absolutely no interior, which is perhaps what we would expect. So I've been I'm free basically to, when we're talking about developing their vocabulary skills, you can take that in any direction you want. So I'm quite free to bring in the integral lenses and find ways.
Could you give us an example of like sort of where you saw like a deficit or something missing in the students' kind of conventional training, and maybe something from the integral coaching or the OCL kind of framework that you brought into it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I give them, I think almost in the first session that we have together, is to get them to start talking about what do we mean by an effective learning environment, and for them to sit in groups and come up with a kind of list of what they think are components of that. And so I think it could be pretty predictable. It was always pretty predictable what they would come up with. And sometimes there was a sense of, the relationship line was something that some of them would talk about, but not so much, and very rarely did anyone have any experience or any knowledge of the more progressive forms of education. They'd all pretty much, I think it's because of this particular university where I work, it needs a high level of A level to get in, and I think most of them, they've been at the grammar school. What are they called again? The gymnasium, which is a pretty, what would you just say, traditional, huh?
Yeah, it's unfair to generalize completely, but I would say the typical German gymnasium is probably closer related to that kind of traditional teacher at the front. You're the dutiful note taker, absorb what's being taken in, demonstrate everything you know back, and don't make any mistakes.
I call it, I talk to them, call it the post box method. Yeah, you're a post box. Teacher comes along, posts something in, and then, you download that, post something back. And I think, so that's what I was picking up, really. It was really difficult to try to generate a sense of aliveness or a sense of we space or a sense in which they were even receptive to one another. It was like, that was their training. They're sitting down, they're expecting to be given some, open their mouth, post something in, go away and do it, get a pat on the head or whatever, get feedback. So yeah, I was surprised really that there wasn't a little bit more, when I'm bringing in these questions about learning environments, for example, there wasn't a little bit more, something coming from a more personal level, I suppose. So it seemed that whole line of their development, their training as teachers had not really been tapped into. Who were they as individuals? What were they bringing themselves? What did they really deeply care about? What values, and therefore they didn't really have any sense of what kind of schools would they going to be able to fit into, other than just reproduce what they already knew, perhaps go back and, most of them wanted to work in the kind of school environment that they'd come from. So I guess, the challenge as I saw it, or what I felt would be definitely interesting for me to do, and hopefully interesting for them, was just to stir things up a little bit and try to engage them in a kind of wider appreciation of what we're dealing with here, with the skill of teaching and facilitating effective learning environments. Yeah. And of course, so bringing in my training in integral and all the different perspectives. Yeah, that's how that kind of happened. And so that's basically where I am now. I'm still an integral coach, still very much involved in integral coaching and conferences. But I think the scope is narrowing for me very much. Especially picking up on the work that you guys are doing and seeing seeing your presentation at IEC last year, Rob, that I thought, wow, fantastic. This is, exactly what excites me, and I feel is something I really deeply care about, education and the way, that things are so narrow at the moment compared to how much more expansive they could be, I guess. So I think that's what the focus is narrowing for me, bringing the integral tools more into how we can, bring that into education, into the classroom, into teacher training. So I'm sort of, working on what my next a kind of iteration will be, somewhere in that direction. I guess that's where I am at the moment.
So Malcolm, I was wondering how receptive your students were to these ideas. You said that you didn't see a lot of those internal kind of reflections or wanting to bring yourself, and that seems very much in line. Those ideas are very much in line with some of the more progressive school ideas, or even the mainstream. And if we're looking at teachers who are from a more traditional background and maybe going back into it, a more traditional background, how were they responsive to it? And did they see that looking at these 3 or 4 models of school was actually beneficial?
Oh yeah. They responded really well. I mean, it's really difficult in a classroom where I think one of the first things is trying to get them to understand that they can share their personal views, and they can listen, and they can talk to one another. It seemed to be something that was quite sort of lacking, I think. It's still the attitude, teacher stands at the front, we sit and listen. So initially, when I was bringing in these charts, it was all a little bit quiet, and what are we supposed to do with this? But giving them because and in their minds as well, I know what's going on. How is this fitting into me getting the points that I need for this course? What is he asking me to do that will help me get these points? So you're dealing with that kind of, it's not necessarily them as individuals, isn't it? It's them as examples of the conditioning that they've been through that you're trying to kind of break down, I suppose. So I try and bring in other things, get them to listen to little podcasts and working groups to share this in the class, so they're starting to open up those windows of opportunity to really listen and share with one another, and then to always be coming back into the thinking about learning environments. It's the first question that I ask them at the beginning of the course. There's an essay that they write in the middle, and then there's a presentation that they give at the end. So hopefully there's a bit of a learning curve where by the end, they're a lot more open and receptive, to want to use these ideas. And then constantly they're asking me, well, what's the next course that you're teaching? Can we come on the next course? So, by no means that's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's definitely a flavor by the end of the course that people want more.
And in education, we often love like the success story or a good anecdote. Have you had any of those that you could share with us of a student who had that learning curve and at the end of your course had a very changed perspective or a new insights on things that they didn't have walking in?
Yeah, well, every semester I've been really, really fortunate. There's somebody who will stop me in the corridor, just by chance and say, I really loved your approach to teaching. or it made me. I on my suggestion, they went and explored a Montessori school and just saw things from another perspective and decided that's where I want to teach. Or they gave, they gave Waldorf school another chance, after hearing all the stuff that they hear. Last year when I was in Britain, or earlier this year when I was in Britain, no, it must have been last year, end of the summer last year, and I was sitting in Dover Castle, actually, just having a few hours in Dover Castle before catching the boat back. And I got an email from a guy who'd been in one of my courses that I think a semester before, and he just said, "I really want to thank you for what you were encouraging us to think about." And because using the 4 quadrants, I was talking about what shows up in upper left, and we were talking. A big theme in that particular course was talking about mental health, looking after our mental health, which was becoming something that was being talked about from different sources at that time. And he said how much he valued this encouragement to do more self-reflection, to try out meditation and things like that. And he said for him, I couldn't have known it as the teacher, but he had been going through a really difficult time, and he'd felt really seen, really supported, really engaged, and had come away with a lot of resources. And so that was very touching, somebody to have taken the time to put that all down in an email. And yeah, like I say, generally people want to know, well, where are you taking us next? What's the next course that you're going to do? So yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, and you touched on the quadrants there. I'd be curious, how do you use the quadrants? Because for those who've maybe listened to us, we've kind of taken the 4 quadrants and kind of split each in half when talking about a school. So you mentioned the upper left, so that would be the kind of interior of the individual. So we do talk about how, often one of the most overlooked parts of a school are the internal beliefs and the internal reactions of every individual, student, teacher, administration, parents, community. Those are all in that mix. And I guess I'll just walk through ours really quick, like lower left, the communities and the cultures. So who are the groups, overlapping groups of people, and what are their norms? Lower right, we say this is the systems and environments. So how are things organized? What do the systems look like? What are the actual physical or digital environments that the school is occurring in or connected to? And then upper right, like the activities and resources. What are you doing in the classroom? What are you doing in a staff meeting? What are you doing in a parent conference? And what are the resources? What are the things you have on hand to do those? And we've found that really useful when looking at where is a school at and where does it want to go? How do you use it in your teaching when applying those kind of 4 areas to new teachers getting into their career?
Well, I mean, one of the sort of themes we've discussed is, I always say to them, when you're going for an interview at a school and you want to try to determine whether it's the one for you, questions like, asking the school heads or whoever's interviewing, what's your policy on bullying, for example. I think questions like that can tell us a lot, about how a school is working in a more integrated way, what is showing up in the quadrants, for example, how they deal with the child who's been bullied, how they deal with the community, what rules do they have in place, what systems to manage it and keep the whole school accountable. So this is one example that I use, to go through the 4 quadrants and look at what needs to show up, to have a comprehensive and effective approach to the this awful thing that some children can experience of bullying. So that kind of opens the window for me in a tangible way that everybody can relate to. Everybody knows, people, everybody has an experience of either being bullied or knows somebody who was bullied. It's something there. So it's really, I think it's one of the such a crucial point in of course managing these microcosms of society, how we care for the community in that sense of helping them. And bullying can be such incidents of bullying can be such a fantastic learning experience for everybody if they're handled in that integral approach. So this is one of the tasks that I set them to think through: what needs to show up in each quadrant for you to feel comfortable that these outbreaks of bullying would be dealt with effectively, and successfully.
Well, on that, and maybe on the idea of learning environments, either of those subjects, what would be some of the most common or maybe best answers that you would hear in each of those quadrants for teachers going into it and wondering how to deal with bullying using the 4 quadrants to structure their thinking? Or if you want to look back at the learning environment idea you talked about earlier, when you ask the prospective teachers to write about a learning environment, what are some of the answers that they give you that resonate with you, or some of the feedback that you give to them in terms of creating a more inclusive or a more integrated learning environment?
Yeah, I guess the main thing I tried, like I sort of talked about before, was just helping us all recognize the importance of the interior, which is so kind of miserably overlooked most of the time, isn't it? We're just sort of there to perform on a cognitive level. So I think one of the usual ways that I have is to bring in this guy called Carl Rogers, the educational psychologist. I mean, really important figure, wasn't he, in the 70s and stuff, and one of the people that was showing these different sort of levels and layers of learning and development. One of the quotes that I really liked from him was that, when I look at the world, I feel pessimistic. When I look at humans, I feel optimistic. And I get them to say, so one of the first essays that they write is, okay, you can either imagine that you are Carl Rogers, give a fuller explanation of what you mean here, of what you're saying here, or just write it from your own perspective. And then we'll look in class at what the difference is, writing from as, or writing looking at. So this is one way to start to tease out this important difference between looking at something and looking as, looking from the interior. And some of the responses are actually really moving, when they're invited to look as and really think about, the world is in a terrible mess, but what do I actually mean when I'm saying that I still feel optimistic when I look at people? What had Carl Rogers seen? And I think this goes to some sort of fundamental sort of value or belief that all of us have, perhaps undetected, is what when it really gets down to the root of it, do we believe that human beings are essentially good and this goodness is something can be to be treasured and to be developed, and therefore the whole approach to development is one of providing the conditions and the experiences to open this treasure, and develop this treasure and get the full impact of this treasure? Or do we believe really deep down, based on whatever conditioning that we've had, that human beings are essentially up to no good, and therefore have to be restrained? And so a whole teaching approach, a whole educational approach, I think, that's one polarity in which you could look at it, I guess. Are we there to open the flower, or are we there to contain, the wild beast and get the best out of it in terms of controlling? So perhaps one polarity would be, is it about release or is it about restraint? And so engaging them with these kinds of questions starts to, encourage and invite people to start talking on a more personal level about what they've experienced at school in their own education. And actually, it informs them a hell of a lot, perhaps more than comes out on the surface, about the kind of teacher they want to be. So releasing all of that and, just playing with these this polarity, just starts to bring a lot more connectivity in the classroom, I would say. I'm not sure if I really got to your question there, Brendan, but did that give you some substance?
No, I think that's good. And one thing that strikes me is that whatever happens in teacher training, as soon as you get in the classroom, as with almost any job, you realize that none of it really helps. But of course it does. It's in there, right? So I guess the question is, how do you attempt to have these teachers keep hold of that, of some of the ideas that you brought to them when they actually enter the classroom, especially if it's a really traditional classroom where they'll be expected to use a textbook and have very teacher-centered lessons? Is there a way that you try and have them keep hold of that?
Well, I guess that's for another course, to probably take that a little bit deeper. I mean, I think, all we can do, isn't it, is sort of provide those resources, give them a taste of those resources, how they might be able to apply them. And I think by opening up this sort of upper left space to allow them to really engage there and realize, what their own personal values is, what kind of teachers they want to become, and light that up and encourage that, I think that's perhaps the best resource I could hope to give at the level that I'm able to influence their development. I mean, I find, for me, endlessly fascinating types, looking at the Enneagram, and of course that's one of the things that I share with them. And we don't get too personal about what different type are you and etc. But my point is to say, look, this is just one way of organizing the kinds of characters that are going to come at you in a classroom, and this gives you some handle, some opportunity to just question yourself. Okay, just hold it lightly. Okay, maybe he's coming at me with a sort of 3 archetypal energy. That gives me a whole different picture than if I'm thinking he's just being a difficult version of me. So I think these do start to open their eyes, and of course give them resources. But again, like with all of us, like you say, Brendan, we can be given a million, wonderful sort of gifts and insights, but what is it when the shit hits the fan? We go back into default mode, and do what we've learned. If it's not become an embodied habit. But I do feel, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? It sort of it kind of warms your heart to see these young people going out there wanting to make an impact, wanting to address the inequalities that they know are in the world, and deal with this kind of new age of tetra, whatever, diversity. That they, my perception has been, once we've started to engage on that level and really talking about what we personally feel and value, I think this is great, just to release them into that type of space where they can feel, okay, that's valued. What I care about, my vision, my way of wanting to engage is really valued. And all I can do is just encourage that. And hopefully something will stick at a crucial moment. They say, oh yeah, I've got that resource, I'll try that. I guess that's all we can do.
Yeah, and I'd be curious if you could walk us through maybe one of your lessons or give us some ideas of what we might typically see in one of your sessions. I'm thinking back to my own teacher training. I'll just share this because it's one of my favorite anecdotes, but we had a 3-hour class on teaching methods. I think it was maybe the second or third week of Teachers College that this happened. And the teacher started slide on the board. She's doing a lecture. We're taking notes. And the first point she's talking about is how ineffective lectures are as a form of teaching. And, you know, two or three of us were like, oh, this is clearly some Andy Kaufman style joke. She's clearly being ironic, lecturing us about how ineffective lectures are, and we should use all these other strategies. And then we were kind of laughing and like, oh, okay, yeah, we get it. And then she got angry at us. Like, no, this is today's lesson. And it was like, really? You're going to sit here for the next 2 hours and 45 minutes lecturing us about all these other strategies rather than trying them or teaching us about them by doing? So I'd be curious, like, what are some of your favorite lessons or favorite approaches to break up that more traditional kind of you at the front? What are some of the activities or discussion formats or activity structures that you do with your group?
Well, I suppose, you know, everything kind of rolls into, you know, the lesson, you know, ideally. I mean, that's so I guess, you know, I could think about, well, when we arrive in the middle of the course, we're focusing in on a James Joyce short story, which they've got the 4-quadrant way of looking. They've got the types. And so we can use this beautiful story called Evelyn, one of the stories from his collection in Dubliners. And then I would break them up into, I give them a whole collection of adjectives, for example, and get them into groups to talk about which adjectives do you feel would apply to Evelyn as you understand her as a character, which ones would you definitely not. What's showing up in the lower right in terms of, because it's just about a young girl who's kind of on the brink of making a massive move in her life from her home life in Dublin and going off with this sailor to Buenos Aires, you know, and she's just a 19-year-old girl, you know, so there's so much resonance in that little 3 or 4 part story, I think, to pick out. So, you know, lower right, of course, they bring out, you know, the Catholic Church, the role of women, and one group I'll make responsible for really showing up in the lower right. Another group really has to try and represent the story. What do they see? You know, blah blah blah. So we're contextualizing the whole time the story, finding all these different layers, and then, you know, I give them a whole series of questions, some explicitly to talk about, you know, how do you type? Would you say Evelyn is more than any others, and what evidence do you have for that? Things like that, you know. And others, what have you learned from, you know, what shows up from you from the upper? So questions which really looking from the different quadrants in particular, or types specifically. And I guess yes, you know, it's that lesson particular. You know, they've all read the story, we've listened to the story together. We listen to the story together in the lesson. There's a beautiful reading from a Dublin actor, which is really moving, you know. So and then yeah, just to develop a conversation. I mean, it's great. I mean, this is the thing with Zoom, you know, classroom Zoom, you know, getting these little breakout rooms is so fantastic. I mean, it's just an excellent facility, I think, rather than trying to climb around groups of chairs and desks in a physical classroom. It's a great way to break them up into groups, and you can go in and listen and put stuff in, you know, put something in the pot for them to talk about. And then you know, leading on from that lesson, there will be, you know, they'll have a couple of weeks to come up with their essay, and that will then produce the next opportunity to discuss, you know, the impact that the lenses and the types have made on their assessment of this story. So, and you know, it's also ticking the box that they're actually feeling, yes, I'm in an English literature lesson, you know. So you know, so many, you know, easy and creative ways, I think, to apply this stuff once you've, you know, realized its beauty yourself.
Well, I think the idea of having a framework for thinking, a lot of what myself and Rob have done in our teaching when we work together, and is try to give students a framework, whether it's thinking about English using something like the 6 traits, breaking writing into organization and grammar and ideas, or whether it's in reading, we look at the keys to comprehension like questioning strategies and inferences. And what this kind of the quadrants idea and the different types of school, the traditional, mainstream, progressive, and so on, what I guess we're trying to do is to build a framework for us to talk about it and to be able to fairly quickly get to a conversation of how we can compare and work out what works and what doesn't in each kind of model. So I want to know how much you think that idea that there are traditional, mainstream, progressive schools in existence, how well does that hold up in the real world? Yeah, is there anything that doesn't quite make sense with it?
Well, for me, it makes absolute sense, and I see it so clearly. I think how you've defined those different approaches, and the Sheen idea is really brilliant as well. To give it that sort of little bit of complexity, of course, but yeah, and once the students start to engage with it, they see it as well. They can very quickly say, "Oh yeah, I definitely went to a." Maybe it had some elements of that. They can become quite sophisticated in their way of defining what they went through and what they would take out of it. It's the important thing, isn't it? Babies and bathwaters stuff. So yeah, so I guess, yeah, for me it does make absolute sense. And once I get students to listen to episode 50 and we look at the chart, and stuff like that, and they can really start to see their own conditioning, I guess, and expectations and what values have been instilled in them, I suppose. Then we can reflect on, what does that mean for them as learners as well as prospective teachers. So again, addressing this question of how we show up as a group, how we evolve this we space, how people take responsibility for that. So yeah, it's for me, it makes absolute sense. Yeah. And it seems to be borne out by their experience as well. It's very, very helpful and clear.
So anyone who knows integral, spiral dynamics, the stage models, they have often given us the feedback similar to what you said, like, oh yeah, I can definitely see this, from the bird's eye view, that yes, I can see those distinctions between traditional, mainstream, and progressive. And of course, there's always a few blurred lines here and there, but that makes sense. But of course, anyone who knows the stages model knows it doesn't stop with green or progressive. There's that post-progressive or teal or yellow integral next stage. We've purposely not discussed it too much yet on the podcast, but within, if anyone's, part of the integral community, there's usually that jump to like, okay, yeah, screw those ones. Like, tell me what's the integral version of this like? And what I think I'm realizing through the conversations Bren and I have had with many is like, that's still getting articulated. That one's not
right
as fleshed out and not as easy to point out in the landscape. It's still kind of coming into its own, but I'd be curious to hear from your perspective.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are some of the characteristics, or what jumps out at you as something new that you see in a more integral, teal, whatever jargony word you want to use, a more post-progressive approach to education?
Yeah, that's the big one, isn't it? I mean, I think the main one would be this sort of showing up of the interior. That we're allowed to be subjective beings and intrasubjective beings, and what does that mean? How would that show up? And I think just looking at the curriculum design from a 4-quadrant point of view just automatically gives you so many kind of ideas of what you would want to instill. And I think just because you always have those interiors, you're always brought back to, okay, what's the kind of experiences that we want to design within a classroom curriculum that will help to bring about those states of mind that are conducive to learning, perhaps, So I think, it's like always been my kind of dilemma in my career, really, is always think, having so many kind of ideas, and I could do this, or yeah, this would be really interesting to do. But until you really get down to root, what do you deeply care about? What do you really feel is of most value in human development? What are we most capable of? And I think once you've, so I think that for me would be what an integral approach to education would be. It would have to start off with everybody really taking time to investigate what is of true value and true meaning to them, and let that sort of start to show up in practical ways, how to create experiences so that is constantly alive and looked after. I know it sounds very vague, there are very much more specific things, of course, we could all point to about what that might, examples of that might be. I don't personally have the experience apart from the students that I teach, in a way that I'm seeing as a more sort of integral space, let's say, where with these kinds of inquiries and the interior can show up. That's my experience. How that might look practically, I think, there are teachers applying, for example, bringing their students into a sitting meditation at the beginning of class. This is teenage kids. I know this may know this teacher in Australia, who's been using this for many years, and the kids value it so much. If you tried to take it away from them now, they would resist very strongly, because it's brought so much calmness and resource to them to deal with the pressures and the stress. So I think, I would build it from these components, finding out what it is we we deeply care about, and what is our vision of the human project. Where is it, where is it best to try to support it, to go, to take it, I suppose, and how to facilitate that development within an educational system. I think one of the things that's going to show up in integral much more, isn't it, is that, you're not a little, island, some microcosm of society in a sort of isolated way, but there's much more community engagement. And I think this whole kind of relational line between parents and teachers and parents and school, that is something that integral could bring so much to really value the different home settings and the different backgrounds and ancestry and lineages of parents, and how to bring that more into an educational learning environment. I remember, just last semester, I'd listened on the radio to this podcast, Tea with an Imam, about this young imam in London, and how he's trying to help his friends, his non-Muslim friends, understand what is Islam, etc., like that. And he has these really nice chats, and there's a beautiful, friendly, open way of trying to engage people with something which is his deep conviction and belief, about, very, very humanitarian, I guess. So I just, we shared that in the class. And so that was something which suddenly, lights went on with the members of the class who have an Islamic or Muslim Islamic faith, and just that ability to feel seen, and it wasn't my explicit intention. It was just something that I found. Yeah, this is a great approach to somebody who's trying to evolve the conversation, let's say, expand the conversation about, this very tense moment in time that we are. But yeah, that was the feedback that I got, even though some of those people didn't say very much at the time, it all came out in the feedback afterwards. So I think things like that, how we have to be integrated within the community, within the society. They have to know about, what local businesses are struggling with, what local politicians are struggling with, and really get them engaged at whatever different stages as they go through their educational development, that would be appropriate to do. Sending kids off on project groups to make money buying and selling T-shirts, for example, things like that. I think all those treasures are there for the integral approach, to start to bring online.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'd like to know, if we are moving forward, what are the babies in bathwater of what's going on in the world right now in your classroom and in education? What are we keeping and what are we getting rid of as we move forward?
We need structures, and as you guys, point out so clearly, the structure, the discipline, the sense of identity and belonging that can come from a traditional mix, the sort of we're in this together that can come from a mainstream mix, I think, isn't it? So one thing that I would dearly love to do is redesign classrooms. I think that's one thing that has to be addressed pretty quickly to get away from this postbox syndrome, as one person standing up as the holder of knowledge, and how, I mean, there are schools, aren't there? You probably experienced it in kindergarten, don't we? When you sit around in little pods, and that's how when there's space in the classroom, I redesigned the classroom for kids, for people to sit in little pods when that was an option. So that I think that's one thing that would really need to be looked at, and all the sort of different technologies that we could bring to facilitate that. There's no excuse really not to revolutionize that learning space, I would say, which could help to put the focus more on the fact that we're all bringing something to the table in terms of what we can find out about and take perspectives on, and so everybody can feel valued for the perspective that they're bringing, I suppose. That's and to be encouraged, that is just a kind of natural everyday way in which we engage with learning, is that we're encouraged and expected to whatever, not in a pressured way, but to enjoy the richness of what's in a classroom, and really make time and space for that to be engaged with on a meaningful and deep level. You don't need to have course book after course book of somebody who's designed that course book or that curriculum sitting in a kind of space which perhaps is not as alive as it needs to be, and is not as dynamic as it needs to be. I think designing curriculum with students, is an approach, of course, in progressive schools often. How far that really goes in reality is another thing. But I think, of course, you have to start, with an integral program, an integral approach to education. You do it, don't you, developmentally over the stages, so that by the time they come to really making decisions that they hold responsibility for, they've got a lot of experience in understanding exactly what that means, and how to make their best shot at that. I would say it's something that's kind of instilled gradually as part of their process of learning. So yeah, that's what I could say right now about it. What specific types of experience you would design, to facilitate that kind of thing is something we can all, have our own way of doing, I guess, isn't it? But I think those fundamental things, what I've just said, I think would be the starting place for me.
And there have been a few out there who've done some of that starting work. Before we pressed record, we were discussing a few books. I wondered if you wanted to bring any other names or references that you direct people to check out.
In the Igniting Brilliance one from Willow D. There is let me just remember her first name, Patricia Gordon. Yeah, she has a really good chapter, The Personal in the Professional, and she sets out what I think is really wonderful to conjure with. I haven't yet used this in my class, but she gives 8 different roles to teachers, 2 for each quadrant, so the inner and the outer. And in the upper left, for example, from an inner upper left perspective, you're a kind of gardener, and from the outer perspective, you're an alchemist, for example. I think they're just names that obviously they make more sense to you as you sort of tune in and really try to feel into what those names suggest. So that's something I'm definitely going to make more time for next semester in the course that's coming up. So 8 key roles for integral teachers, it's called, that correspond to looking at and looking as, from each of the different perspectives. And I think this sort of, for me, it what leapt out at me. I mean, we're always saying, aren't we, as teachers, we're playing so many different roles. And this is something you kind of bring out. There's an emphasis on being more of a coach, or there's emphasis on being more of a supervisor or whatever. But the reality is, we're depending on the situation, we want to be flexible and free to jump into different roles as necessary, because that's what it takes to be in a living, dynamic system of young people. And I think what Patricia Gordon does in this article is just sort of, give that some structure and some texture. And again, like all the integral tools, isn't it? It's sort of a template that you can put over the sort of chaotic world of that we're living in, and just start to be able to tease out some clarity, and how these things talk to one another, how they're part of polarities, the different polarities that are there. So I think that's something that I would definitely draw people's attention to. The way that, yes, as teachers, we are playing different roles, but we can do it with a little bit more clarity and a little bit more consciousness that this is what we're stepping into now. This requires this kind of role. And once I've got that awareness, that consciousness of these different roles that I'm playing, of course, then the sort of developmental thing kicks in. There are different stages to develop my skill and my understanding. And so I've always got, I mean, I think one thing I always try and say to teachers, always go away with a question. What's the next question? What's the main question that's come up from your experience today, and how to hold that and see what comes through. See how you can, how life responds. But the clarity of the question is really important, isn't it? In our kind of personal development, I guess, knowing at specifically what stage we're at, what stage is opening up, and to define that in a kind of question can be really important.
So here's something, it's kind of a different way of asking the same question I've already asked, but what does school look like in 100 years?
In 100 years?
We'll still be here, of course. We'll all
still, yeah.
We'll get to experience.
Yeah, you could take it in so many different directions. I mean, it's sort of very much about what kind of, planet we'll be living on here. What are the kind of life conditions like? And I would think we definitely will have moved away from this idea that this is just some kind of block of time in a person's life. You have your childhood, you play, you don't give a damn about what day it is, and then suddenly you put in a box and you have to formalize everything, and and learn and blah blah blah, and then you move on, you go back into the mess. It's got to be much more fluent, I would say. You know, the educational environment in 100 years' time will be something that's not sort of designated in a sort of box-like fashion, that this is when it starts, this is when it ends. You know, you've got the option then to take it a little bit further, but it's a kind of, you know, constant flow, and engaging, you know, flow, a developmental flow, so that, you know, using integral, you know, the integral, the emergence of integral as a level of consciousness. Hopefully, you know, in 100 years' time, we will have a sort of tipping point around that, if not, you know, long before, hopefully. So there will be this, you know, this way of looking at and looking as the world from these different developmental stages, and seeing that, you know, life is this one flow, you know, and being very much more aware and conscious of what the different options are at every different stage of that developmental journey, I suppose. I wouldn't like to think that we're still having specific buildings and locations designated as schools, as learning environments. Let's say the shape of education would be, you know, it's just one aspect of any situation that we're in, you know, that we're receiving feedback from. We've got specific tasks that we can learn from, everything that's pushing our development and our consciousness. You know, that for me would be what would make sense in a you know, in a 100 or a few hundred years time.
Do you know much of Illich's work, even Illich?
Only by name, I think. I think I did read something some time ago, but not something that stuck. No.
The Deschooling Society, which is a bit dated now, but it's from the 70s. I mean, it really talks about that. And of course, a lot of those books were written at the end of the 60s, early 70s, that believed it was just around the corner. And
yeah.
we're further away from that now in many ways. But things like the internet have brought it closer. So a lot of what you're saying is kind of similar to what he was saying of basically, we wouldn't have this formalized education anymore. There wouldn't be places necessarily called schools. It would be fully integrated into the society and much more fluid. So yeah,
it's dependent on a lot of other things changing as well, isn't it? You know, I think the 60s were such a, you know, liberating time in many ways. You know, you know, everybody was getting psychoanalyzed, and there are all these different approaches to thinking about the self and whatever. But then, you know, they gave the job of organizing society to the capitalists. As we know, you know, it was all handed over to the bankers. You know, you kind of get on with it and let the market determine. And of course, we need to be able to, you know, wrench ourselves away from that that sort of emphasis, that you know, one side of the polarity which is weighing us down. And so I think this idea of you know, having a vision, keep having the vision for what an integral world might look for, I think is a really powerful contribution we can make, despite the fact that we see you know, this immovable might of capital in the world, and all the horrors and you know, problems that's bringing with it. To you know, getting this balance again to a much more humanistic approach, which I think is where the 60s and the 70s, full of their, you know, energy and wisdom, was coming from. And then it kind of got, as these things do, it got squashed. So I think, yeah, it's having to move in very subtle ways, isn't it? Almost beneath the radar, and then suddenly pop, you know, out of the crack in the pavement, in the concrete pavement, something emerges. You know, there's life. So I guess it'll probably emerge like that. The force of that, you know, I think there's some mushrooms, isn't it, that have got the ability, the force to crack concrete or tarmac. You know, they bring their resources to such a focal point to emerge that concrete won't stop it. And that's inspiring, huh?
Is there anything still on your heart that feels left unsaid to help make this conversation feel complete?
The only thing would be, you know, I think we didn't have that much time for me to hear from you guys, you know, about your visions of, what's emerging, because you're much more in the sort of cooking pot, I think, than I am on a day-to-day basis. So I think you must have so many, if you've got time to decompress and download what's going on, I think that would be a great conversation to have as well, just to hear from you guys, what's coming to mind, and how do you see things playing out? What kind of mushrooms are you going to be facilitating the growth of?
Or maybe you can interview us next time.
Yeah, it would be wonderful.
Maybe
Yeah,
in a month or so, we flip the classroom, and you can interview us.
Well, think about it. I think that would be great. I think yeah, for me, fantastic. I'd love to know what you guys think and what you're seeing, and I'm sure so many people who are listening to your podcast would benefit hugely from hearing that as well. Yeah.
Cool. Let's set that up then.
All right. Well, thanks a lot then.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. It's a pleasure to get to know you, and thanks for the conversation.
Welcome. Yeah, I always love to talk about education. Yeah, so thanks for stimulating that and inviting me. Yeah, it's been great.
So that was our chat with Malcolm Giles. Hope you enjoyed it. We ran through a whole host of reinventing education ideas that we've touched on before, and some new ones. And I think we threw out the invitation at the end there for Malcolm to interview us and flip the classroom, flip the switch, flip the tables soon. So let's see how that goes.
We really appreciated Malcolm reaching out to us, and consider this an invitation perhaps for you to do the same. You can find us at reinventingeducationpodcast.podbean.com. You can email us at reinventingeducationpodcast@gmail.com. We used to end our episodes with a little blurb saying, hey, find us on Facebook. We've got a group there. Find us on Twitter. It really seems like it's been difficult to generate like a true sense of community through a lot of social media. And what's been happening kind of spontaneously over maybe the last year or so is bit by bit, people are coming out of the woodwork and connecting with us. And this just seems to be far more fruitful than trying to conjure up something digitally. So please, if you're interested in the ideas we're sharing, or you know somebody who's doing something quite progressive or post-progressive within the educational world, put them in touch with us. Let's have a chat. And if it seems worthwhile that you'd like to be a guest on the show, by all means. We really appreciate that this podcast is turning into one of the meeting points for people doing really interesting things in education worldwide, and connecting folks who are kind of on the same page but don't really know about each other or know of the great work that others are doing. So consider this an invitation. Get in touch with us. Let's develop some cool, meaningful, possibly fruitful relationships. Thanks, Brennan.
Thanks, Rob.